My name is Ken Saunders, and I'm a grateful recovering alcoholic. Good morning, everybody. My job is to introduce our speaker for the morning. I told him I was going to spend a lot of time with him, and he's been chasing me and been following me, and I haven't had any time to spend with him. And but I tell you this, I observe a lot of people. I like to watch people, and I observed certain people such as Mike H. from Richmond, to make sure they show up for communion and choir practice and what have you. I'm just kidding. But I watched this gentleman that's going to share with us this morning and bring the message to us. And Russell, I think I found one thing that might be unique. He's a preacher, and there's nothing unique about that. I told him I might kid him and joke him a little bit, but when I say there's nothing unique about that, I've got a sponsor that's a preacher, and some other preachers here. There's nothing unique about that, but I think you would enjoy my sharing this with you. And Tom, I don't know if this is a first or not, but I've watched this gentleman, John, the entire weekend, and I'm telling you, he's didn't cost him anything, but he sure got his money's worth. He has participated in everything. I don't think I can ever recall, John, having one of our illustrious speakers to join in the choir with us, and we appreciate having you this morning in the choir. And he's back there playing and singing music with us, and he's been in the coffee lounge the whole weekend, and I think he's walked about 15 miles up here listening to something he had hung in his ear there. And we're just delighted to have him this morning. And I hope I don't get this wrong, but you've heard the best, now you hear the rest. I mean, I got that backwards. You've heard the rest, and so I'm sure that I'm going to present to you now the best. And I've never heard him, and I look forward with great anticipation, and it's certainly a joy and a pleasure to present to you this morning another alcoholic, sober alcoholic, member of Alcoholics Anonymous here at Blackstone with us. And I'll give you John B. from Indianapolis, Indiana.
There was a young, good morning. We could have stopped, I think, right with the choir. I think everything is anticlimactic after this. And I'm delighted to be here. And I saw the glass of water under the podium, and it reminded me of the story. Being a preacher, you hear a lot of preacher stories. Russ, you probably heard this one. The young preacher who was working under quite an orator, and this preacher just drew them by the thousands, but every once in a while he'd take a Sunday off, and this young aspiring student would have to preach, and every time he did it, he got nervous. He just shook. He lost his place. He stumbled around, looked out. People were sleeping. And his time was coming up, and he ran into the senior preacher's office, and he said, look, he said, I can't preach Sunday. He said, I just have decided I can't be a preacher. And the senior preacher said, now sit down. Relax a minute, and let's talk about it. He said, what seems to be the problem? He said, I don't know. I get so nervous. I'm not like you. I'm not an orator. I lose my place. And he said, look, let me tell you something. You notice that when I preach, that I have a glass of water. And he said, I sip it. And I go on. And the kid said, no. He said, look, that's not going to work for me. And he said, wait a minute. He said, what I want you to do is you get a double shot of gin, and you put that in there with a little dry vermouth. And he said, then as you're going along, if you feel you're getting nervous, you just sip it. So the kid thought he'd try it. And the day came, and he did what the senior preacher told him. He didn't lose his place. He held his audience. He was fantastic. It worked. And he stood at the door to greet the people on the way out, and everybody just kind of walked by him. Wouldn't say anything, gave him dirty looks. And he thought, oh my God, what have I done? So he ran into the senior preacher's office Monday morning. He said, look, something terrible happened. He said, I did everything you told me to do. He said, no, you didn't, son. I didn't have to go out of town. I was sitting up in the back. He said, I told you to sip it, and you gulped it. And he said, you forgot to take the olives out of it. He said, in the third place, David slew Goliath. He didn't kick the shit out of him. Now, on that note of spirituality, I'd like to tell you my name is John Burbank. I'm a very grateful, recovered alcoholic. My home group is the Bell Ringer Group, which I believe is the best group in the world in Indianapolis, Indiana. But I'm sober today because he touched me. Because that marvelous grace that has invaded our lives and brought us together touched me too. And I don't believe it's any other thing, or any other reason that I'm here today. And I don't say that because I'm a preacher. I say that because I'm a very grateful, recovered alcoholic. I did not experience that wondrous grace that holds us all in a church setting. I experienced it in a smoke-filled room where a man got up and shared with me and others in that room his story. He shared his experience and his strength and his hope. And when that meeting was over, I was touched. And I'll tell you about that. I want to thank the committee for the wonderful time that I've been having here. And you're right, Kenny, I have enjoyed participating. I really have. When I came here on Thursday night with my lovely wife, Barb, they had a special meeting on Thursday night for the speakers that come in, and the people are there, and at 8 o'clock, and there was an aura in that room. And people got up and they shared just a few minutes. Dave kind of introduced us, and they shared about 5 minutes of what Blackstone meant to them. And it was obvious that Blackstone had had a tremendous impact on their lives. And I'm sitting there and I'm listening, and everyone would seem to say, I don't know what it is, but there's something about Blackstone. I don't know what it is, but there's something about Blackstone. And I pondered that. It got my head going, and I'm a kind of a curious bird. And I thought, well, what is it? What is it about Blackstone? What is it? And I listened to the speakers, and I walked among you and shared with you, and I had a marvelous time in that back room listening to those guys pick those guitars and sing those songs. The conversation in the coffee room, the little talks with people I'd never met before. And this morning, when we gathered at the breakfast table and Ray said the grace, came to me. Ray said it. Ray said, God moving among us. God moving among us. That's what Blackstone, that's it. In whatever form, whatever way, that's what's happened. I feel it, I sense it. And you know, that's the reason we're here. You know, I was raised in New England. I'm a New England Yankee, in case you don't know that. But don't hold that against me. And I was raised a Congregationalist, and I was raised in a home where I learned about God. It wasn't my own home. It was a foster home. I was abandoned by an alcoholic father at the age of 5. My alcoholic father took me and my little brother Rich. It was after our mother had died, and took us to this little town in New England in the beautiful Berkshire Hills. And here we stood in front of a strange house and a strange woman, and my dad said, "This is your new home, and this is your new mother." And he left. And I didn't see him again for maybe twice the rest of my life. I experienced abandonment early in my life. And I'm not saying that made me an alcoholic. Don't get me wrong. But I've always had the feeling I'm going to get abandoned. And I was raised in this New England home by this church-going congregational woman whom we called Aunt Pearl, and she made us go to church and Sunday school, and she taught us about God. And the God she taught us about wasn't that God that moves amongst us and touches us and heals us. It was a God, she said, that was going to punish me if I didn't do right. And if of all things I never was to turn out like my alcoholic father. Don't ever be like your father. And it was that moralistic, thou shalt not kind of religion that formed my early attitudes on drinking and getting drunk and alcohol. And when I lost control, that I did in a young age, the only thing I could believe about myself was I was like my father. And she told me my father was no good. And that was it. I had failed. I wasn't a good Christian. I wasn't a good man. I had failed because I'd lost control. I drank my way through the Second World War. I went to chapel. I always had this religious bent in me. I always had the feeling, but I've got to get right. I've failed, but someday I've got to get right. And when I came to Detroit, Michigan, after the Second World War, I joined that little brother Rich that I was abandoned with, and with whom I grew up, the only one of 5 children. And we had a strong bond, a strong sibling rivalry, and as soon as the war was over, I wasn't going to settle down in that little western Massachusetts town and work in a paper mill all my life. I didn't know what I was going to do, but I was going to find Rich, and I was going to be with Rich. And I joined him in Detroit, Michigan, and Rich had become a full-fledged alcoholic. He had not served in the Army. He was a 4F. And when I came home, he saw me with the combat infantry badge and the stripes, and by golly, he thought I was General Patton. All I needed was a pearl-handled revolver. He always had me on a pedestal. He would always do whatever I did. I was his ideal. Little did he know how I felt inside. I always dominated him. Anything I would do, Rich would do. I remember I still had this religion, and Rich was a down-and-out atheist. He said, don't give me God stuff. I said, well, Rich, I'm joining a church. I'm going to find a church I'm going to join. I was still afraid of God. And I joined a Lutheran church. Well, Rich would do anything I do. He's an atheist. He said, okay, I'll join too. That's all. I drank very heavily. We both did. And I drank my way out of the University of Detroit. But I was going to this church, and I was filled with guilt. And I thought, I've got to go confess my sins to my minister. I've got to get right. And I went to see my minister. He was a young man. He didn't know anything about alcoholism, but he was a charitable young man. And he said, I said, you know, I feel like a hypocrite. I'm at church every Sunday. I'm singing in the choir. I said, but I can't stay sober. I drink during the week, and I need to tell you this, and I don't know what to do. And he didn't know anything about alcoholism, and he said, look, he said, you know, I really think that you don't have any goal in life, do you? And I said, no, I don't have any goal in life. I've been going to university, but they've thrown me out. I don't know what I want to do in my life. And he said this, did you ever think about being a minister? I was dumbfounded. I'm in to see him about a booze problem, and he's asking me if I ever thought God moves in mysterious ways. And I said, yes, I have. I had a minister as a kid that I looked up to. And I thought, gee, it would be wonderful to be a minister and be like him. And he said, look, there's a seminary you can go to, and you'll have a goal in life, and I don't think this alcohol is going to trouble you at all. And I went home to where Rich was, and I said, Rich, I said, the problem's over. He said, what problem? He was probably hungover. I said, I don't have to drink anymore. He said, why not? I said, I'm going to be a minister. He said, good, so am I. 2.5 years later, we're in a drunk tank in Springfield, Illinois, both of them. We decided to get drunk rather than take a theological exam, and the Holy Fathers called us in. They found out we'd been in jail. What were you doing in a drunk tank? And we said, well, we got drunk. And the Holy Fathers didn't think much of that, and they said they kicked us out. And I felt like protesting. I didn't. I felt like saying, well, how are you going to preach about sin if you don't do it? You know. But that was the old moralistic attitude, sin. So I wasn't going to be a minister. I didn't have a goal anymore. I went back to selling shoes. But I started to drink psychopathically, I think suicidally. I didn't want to live anymore. I was married to Barbara. I'd met her at that New Year's Eve party she told you about. And she said Barbara's a perceptive person, and she would see how sick I was, and I'd say to her, honey, if I should die. And I guess she sensed suicide in that. And she said, you better see a psychiatrist. So I went to a psychiatrist, and he did put me through his tests, and he come up with the final verdict. He said, well, I think I know what's wrong with you. And I thought, oh, boy, at last, somebody's going to tell me what's wrong with me. And he said, you miss your father. And I did. And then he said what I wanted him to say. I'll have a few beers with the boys. So I went on missing father and getting drunk. And I finally got back into the Lutheran Church, a more liberal branch. They drank a little more, I think. And I did get through college. I got in trouble in college for drinking, but they passed me on through. And I was to attend graduate school in Chicago, and I came there with my wife and our first daughter, and we had settled down at the seminary grounds, and suddenly I got a notification that the president wanted to see me, and I knew something was wrong. I just knew if the president wanted to see me, I was in trouble. And I walked into his office, and he said, "Well, how's the world treating you?" Like that, and I knew I was in trouble the way he said it, that kind of pious voice. And I said, "Okay." He said, "Well, we found out about you. You've been kicked out of one seminary. You almost just got kicked out of the college from which you just graduated, and we don't think you belong here, Mr. Burbank. You got problems. You're not going to be a student here." And there I was, no more goal in life. And I thought, the heck with it. I'll get drunk at him. That's what I do. I get drunk at him. And I went out and got drunk, and that was the drunk that led me to my first exposure to the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous. When I got off that drunk, my wife said to me, "Call AA." We'd heard of AA from an older brother, Don, who was an alcoholic. 3 of us brothers are alcoholics. And this older brother, Don, now he wasn't spiritual like I was. He worked for the syndicate on the East Coast. He was in Baltimore. There's a lot of Maryland people here. And Don committed a felony under the influence of alcohol, was put in jail or prison. And while he was there, the AAs came in bringing the message of hope behind the walls. And my brother went to the meetings behind the walls. And he found out what was wrong with him behind the walls. And he found freedom behind the walls because the people of Alcoholics Anonymous were carrying the message of hope. And my brother found out what was wrong with him. And he did his time, and he got out, went into the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous, and stayed sober until he died. And I buried him in Baltimore in 1969. But he had written to us and said, "Hey, I found a way how not to drink one day at a time through this offbeat group called Alcoholics Anonymous." Barbara said, "Call them." I would have called Santa Claus. And I called AA, and, you know, I really appreciated Harold last night. Harold said something that Harold is a prophet. I don't care what anybody says. But Harold said something about how we're waiting for these treatment centers to send them in and like this, and forgetting, I think, sometimes that we need to go carry the message. I called Alcoholics Anonymous in Chicago. That was, I think, in 1951 when I was there. And they said, "We'll send somebody over to talk to you just as soon as we can. Where are you?" And I'm pacing the floor, waiting for this someone to come from Alcoholics Anonymous. And finally, I looked out the window. I'm going out of my skin. I want to drink. And this big car drives up, and this well-dressed little guy came up to the door, and he knocked at the door, and I thought, that's no alcoholic. Alcoholics don't drive cars like that. They don't dress like that. I expected some guy to jump out from a bush, in a GI, with a GI raincoat and sneakers and take me to a mission and get me saved, And this fellow said, "No, my name is Leo. I'm from Alcoholics Anonymous, and if you'd like, I'll take you to a meeting. There's a meeting tonight in the engineer building. Would you like to go?" I said, "I'll go." And on the way to the meeting was the first time that I found out that it wasn't because I was a bad guy that I lost control. It was because And on the way to that meeting, Leo tried to explain it to me. He said, some people are allergic. Now look, they didn't have all the information we get now about the THIQ and the brain and all this. He said, but some people are allergic to strawberries. You ever seen that? He said they itch, they get bumpy, they scratch, they're allergic. He said, well, I'm allergic to alcohol. There's something about me that is physically different. I work in a treatment center now, and I do a lot of talking. And I tell these patients that are bound and determined that they're going to conquer it through their willpower, trying to explain to them that there is a physical condition that defies that. And I say, if you really think you're going to control it by your willpower, I would like you to try a test. I'd like you to get a box of X-Lax, eat the box of X-Lax, get in your car, make it to St. Louis without doing anything in your pants on your willpower. That's the chance an alcoholic has with his willpower. And Leo said, plus the fact, I don't only have this physical condition, but I've got a mental obsession with it. It's something when I was a drinking alcoholic, it drove me. I had no choice. I was driven by an insanity that decreed my destruction. And I'm saying, okay, all right. It's a disease, and that's good. And I went to the meeting, and it was a big room, bigger than this, and they were all smoking, and you could cut it with a knife, and laughing and chattering and drinking coffee. And there was that kind of something in that room. But I still had a problem. And the big book in chapter 5 said it in these words. Many of us tried to hold on to our old ideas, and the result was nil until we let go absolutely. And I had a lot of old ideas, those old moralistic ideas, that if only I could get to be a better man, then I could be in control. That's all I had to do. Get more faith in God. Be a better man, and then I could drink socially. So AA didn't take. I stayed with him a while, till I got a job, till I got an apartment. All that came through AA, incidentally. Anything good that's happened in this preacher's life has come through the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous. Anything. And it wasn't long. One Sunday morning, Barbara and I were walking down a street in Chicago, and I used to do a lot of singing. I really have a resentment. You didn't let me sing a solo. Pipes are kind of rusty anyway. But I had to sing at a Jewish wedding. I'd lost a job at Marshall Field, and I was selling shoes on State Street. And this Jewish proprietor said, I got a daughter that's getting married. I hear you sing. Will you sing at her wedding? I said, sure. Well, I was a Methodist then. I didn't know anything about Jewish weddings. I was through with the Lutherans. And so Barbara and I are walking down the street on Saturday morning, and I said to her, I don't need Alcoholics Anonymous. I don't believe in this disease stuff. I'm all right now. Well, I know what I was getting ready to do. I was going to sing at that wedding, and I didn't know anything about Jewish weddings, and I was insecure, and I knew what would fix that. So just before the wedding, I got me a double shot in the bar of the Windermere East on the south side of Chicago. I got a couple of double shots, and I took them, and I sang like a birdie. They loved me. And I drank for 19 more years. And I drank for 19 more years. Anything good that's happened to me has come through Alcoholics Anonymous. I was in one of my dry spells. And any time I got out of control and things got real bad and I lost a job or Barbara's leaving or threatening to leave, I'd say, I'll go back to AA. I won't drink anymore, I'll promise you. Just stay with me. Don't leave me, honey, I love you. And I'd go back to AA. And I was back in one of those dry periods. I wasn't sober, I was dry. I was just like this. And I met a guy who was studying to become a Presbyterian minister. And he was going to be a chaplain in the Army, and he was attending an open meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous, and I kind of found out about him, and I went up and caught him and said, you know, I still would like to be a minister. I told him the terrible things the Lutherans had done to me. And the Methodists, they wouldn't touch me with a 10-foot pole, you know. And the Southern Baptists, I'm sure they wouldn't have anything to do with it. But he said, well, you still want to be a minister? Why don't you go down to the McCormick Seminary here, where I'm going, and tell them you're an alcoholic. Don't lie to them like you have to everybody else. And I thought, well, I think I'll do it. And I went down to that seminary, and I told them I was an alcoholic, but I was in AA, and I was dry then. And they said, good, you'll make a good minister, come on. Love to have you. And then they said something I really liked. They said, now, some of our boys here drink beer. I thought, hot dogs. You know, I can be religious without giving up liquor. See? So I drank my way through. I don't know how I got through, but I can remember that the thing I think that saved me, really, was that I took a small country church as a student pastor, and I would go to seminary during the week, and I'd have to be at that church on weekends. And I'd do some drinking during the week, but on weekends I had to be down serving that church, preaching sermon, visiting people, and so forth. So I didn't drink. And then when I graduated, by the skin of my teeth, that little church called me and ordained me as its pastor. And this little town was about 1,200 people, Republicans, conservative. I was a Democrat. I was for Kennedy. I almost got run out of there account of that. But one thing I knew not to do in that small town was drink. I knew not to drink in that small town. They had 2 saloons, but I did not dare drink. But if I wanted to drink, I'd think of my good old alcoholic brother, Rich. He'd moved to Chicago. And I could be to Chicago in about 2 hours, and I'd go on some evangelistic conference or a conference on religious living, and we'd really tie one on, you know. And I'd come home, hungover, sick, nervous, hating myself, but nobody knew except that loving God, that loving wife, and myself. And I don't think Rich remembered. I'd like to tell you about Rich. Rich ended up in Skid Row in Chicago. He called me one day. I was in a dry period after I'd gone to the second church I'll tell you about, but he said, you got any money? I was an enabler for Rich. I always dominated by helping him. And I always gave him money or whatever it was. So he called me one day and he said, I need money. Wire it to me. I'm on Madison Street, Chicago. I said, look, have you got any money? He said, yeah, I got a dime. I said, okay, I want you to take that dime. You call Alcoholics Anonymous. I'm not sending you any money. He took the dime, he called Alcoholics Anonymous, and Rich ended up sober. The other brother was in prison and he ended up sober. Rich was sober 12 and a half years, and he got a ravaging form of cancer in 1982. And I'd go from Indianapolis to Chicago to be with him, and he's laying on his deathbed. He looked up at me and he said, gee, John, thank God for the program. And the night before he died, I'm standing over his bed, and this little brother that we'd fought, had this rivalry we had fought. He looked up to me, he said, I love you, John. I said, I love you, Rich. And he died. Anything good that's happened to me has come through Alcoholics Anonymous. The next church I went to was a suburban church. These Presbyterians drank. They liked to drink. They weren't like the little country Presbyterians. And when they heard the preacher liked to drink, they thought the kingdom of God had come. and I got invited to their parties. And my poor wife would be scared stiff, and she had reason to be. Because I'd go to their parties, I'd black out and go crazy. And the next morning she'd say, "You embarrassed me last night, the way you acted." I said, "Honey, I didn't do anything. I just had a couple of beers. You were chasing the deacon's wife around the dining room table or something." And all of a sudden the word begins to filter through the congregation that this little preacher, he's a nice little guy, but when he drinks, he's crazy. Don't give him any. They cut me off. And if he comes in, and I had a curious route of pastoral visits where the liquor was. And they said, when he comes to make those pastoral visits, don't give him any. He's not coming to pray, he's coming to play. And they cut me off. And I started my lonely drinking. And I thought, where am I going to drink? Barbara didn't like me. Barbara never, she's right, she never poured it down the drain, but she didn't like me drinking at home, and I thought I got to find a place to drink. I found a place, the church. Nobody down there at night. I'd go down there and take my vodka and drink. That lonely, isolated, alcoholic drinking in the church. One night I'm drinking, I pass out. Not black out, pass out. And I wake up and I hear this beautiful music, like angels, like you sing, Hilda and Sandy. Beautiful. And I thought, oh my God, I've died, I'm going across, I'm going home. And then I shook again, it was my choir in the next room getting ready for Sunday. And if anybody had walked into the study, they'd found the little preacher, not on his knees, on his back, knocked out. And that's the way it went. And finally, I want to bring you up to the point where, you know, our stories, what it was like, what happened, what was the turning point? I finally got to Indianapolis, took the church, I was dry, I'd been back to AA because I'd gotten on a drunk on a vacation, decided to try AA again. Been sober about 14 months, hadn't surrendered or anything, and I'd taken this church that I now have in Indianapolis, and I told them I was an alcoholic. I'd come in there telling them I'm an alcoholic. My congregation, I'm still with that church, and they love me dearly, and I love them dearly, and they know I'm an alcoholic. But I had to have one more shot at it. And they said, we'll put you downtown in a storefront ministry, and you can work with the winos and the derelicts. If you're an alcoholic, you sure can help those people. So I went down there on the street, and I had a little old empty barber shop and a coffee pot and chairs, and the guys would come in, and I got a little guy through treatment up in the VA hospital, a black guy, a man of the streets. And when he come back out, he started working with me, and boy, that place went crazy. And the guys were coming in there, and they had guns and knives, and I'm telling you, there weren't any stained glass windows and no cushioned pews or candles or nothing. It was ministry in the raw. And I'm a devout coward, and I got scared down there. And I'd have to take care of my nerves every once in a while. I wouldn't go to God, I'd go to what was my God and was still my God, alcohol. And every once in a while I got drunk myself until something happened. One of the little guys I worked with that I put through the VA hospital got out, got a motel room on the northeast side of Indianapolis, and drank himself to death. We carried him out under a sheet. And I loved the little guy. He'd been to my church. I'd worked with him when I was dry. And I remember going to the funeral home and standing over his casket and looking down on him, and he was at peace. The torment was over. But I knew what had killed him. He died from the disease of alcoholism. And I'm looking down at that little guy, and all of a sudden I'm not seeing that little guy. I'm seeing me. And something saying to me, you're a dying man. You're hopeless. Nothing's working. You're going to end up losing your dear wife, your ministry, your God. You're going to die a lonely, alcoholic death. And I saw me in that casket. And I'm telling you, the ones that don't make it, bless us. God showed me something in that man. He showed me myself. And all of a sudden I got panicky and I got scared. And I began to believe this is a fatal disease and I'm dying. And I headed for a meeting. And that beautiful, wonderful power was waiting to meet me in the person of Bob M., who got up that night, a man I'd never seen, a man who'd been in recovery, sober for 17 years, very distinguished-looking guy, red face, red nose. God, he looked like a drunk. I was just attracted to him like that, you know. And he said, "My name is Bob, and I'm an alcoholic." And he said, "I'm not here to entertain you or tell you." He said, "But I believe that the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous brings hope to those who find themselves powerless." And that word hope struck me deep. And I hung on every word that man said. And as that man unfolded his story, we have to tell our stories. There's somebody out there identifying with me today. I know it. We've got to tell our stories. We've got to share our experience, not our theories, our strength and our hope. And as Bob did that, all of a sudden something's happening. I'm not seeing myself in the casket anymore. I'm seeing myself in Bob. Hey, I can be like him. I'll go to the meetings. He's talking about hope. And when the meeting was over, I felt like a weight was lifted. I was been touched by something. Something was gone. The burden was lifted. And I turned to Barbara and I said, that was it. I didn't have any wisecracks, no analysis to make, no criticisms to make. I was free. I knew it. I was touched. And that power that touched me was love. It wasn't punishment. It wasn't you got to prove yourself. It was, I love you right here, where you're in your despair and your pain and your hurt. I love you. Amazing grace. How sweet the sound that saved a wretch, a wretched man like me. I once was lost, and now I'm found. That's who we are. We're found. Every single one of us. We wouldn't be here today. And I didn't do anything. I've come to believe that a power greater than myself restored me to sanity. There was a time when I did not have an obsession that decreed my destruction. When I didn't think about drinking, I was restored. It was gone. And that power is absolutely trustworthy. Absolutely trustworthy. I made a decision to turn my will and my life over to the care of that power that is absolutely trustworthy, or I would not be here this morning. People say to me, because I'm a preacher, how do you turn your will and life over to God? And I say, you don't turn your will and life over to God. That's the third step. No, it's not the third step. The third step is we made a decision to turn our will and life over to the care of God as we understood him. I had turned my life and will over to alcohol. It was destroying me. Anytime you see me in an AA meeting, whether I'm sitting down there listening or we're in a group discussing or I'm up here talking, anytime, I want you to know I've made a decision to allow this loving God to care for me. That's why I go to meetings. This is where I meet God in you and you. People say, hey, my gosh, you've been sober since 18 years almost. What do you still go to those meetings for? I said, because I made a decision to turn my will and life over to the care of God. And my God works through people like you who will help me be honest. People like you who walked in my shoes. People like you who finally learned, like I have, what it means to love somebody and receive love. That's what that decision is about. I've had to clean house. I found things in my life that needed to go. I don't need to name them. I did that with my people I did my fifth step with. I don't have to do that here. But I learned something about those character defects, that I can get into a trap and think I got to get awful perfect so that I can be Mr. Righteous. But that isn't what the seven-step prayer says. Seven-step prayer says, I want to get rid of these defects of character, God, because they're blocking my usefulness to you and to others. And it's for that reason I owe my loving God my life. I owe you my life. And I don't want anything blocking my effectiveness with you. That's why they got to go. And I don't proclaim that I'm perfect and that they don't crop up. They do. But at least I've got a focus. And I've had to make my amends, my living amends. I always said, I'm sorry. And Barbara said, you're always saying, I'm sorry. You're always sorry. And I had to make living amends. My life had to say, I want to live in a different relationship to you. I want to live in a right relationship to you and to my children, to my brother that I was reconciled with at his deathbed. I thought I knew a lot about prayer. I didn't know anything about prayer until I met you. I didn't know anything about meditation. I had books. I could read them. I could read prayers. You told me that to continue to seek, to improve that conscious contact, to nurture that loving relationship that had come into play now through prayer and meditation. And I do that with the little things you put in my hands, like the 24-hour book and the Day at a Time, and Christian literature that I use. I start my day with a quiet time. I end my day with God to thank Him. I'd never do that. Having had a spiritual awakening as a result of the steps, I really believe that the fellowship of AA and you people know more about conversion than we in the church. You really know what a conversion is. Having had a spiritual awakening. I heard the girl say it yesterday. Unless I had a psychic change, a profound psychic change, I couldn't make it. And that's what happens as we share our journey together and work these steps. We change. We don't become saints. We don't claim that. We claim spiritual progress, not perfection. But we change. I'm going to close with a fantasy. I picture this loving God looking down on his children, and he sees us drunks, and we're dying, and our families are dying, and the churches aren't doing it, and the ministers aren't doing it. The ministers can't stay sober themselves. And the psychiatrists aren't doing it, and I'm not trying to knock any good psychiatrist or any good minister or any good priest. But this loving God is looking down, and he's saying, but these, my children, are dying. They're not getting healed. I got to find a way. And he grabbed that stockbroker by the name of Bill W., and he gave him a profound spiritual awakening. And then he leads him out to Akron. He lets the business thing go boom. And there's old Bill standing in the lobby of the Mayflower Hotel, and the cocktail lounge is there, and Bill describes it in the music, and he's coming out, and the old alcoholic fears are setting in, and they're saying, why not have a drink? But Bill's got another voice at work in him, the Spirit of the living God. And that Spirit is saying, Bill, find a drunk and work with him. Find a drunk and work with him. Call the churches. And he did. And Mrs. Sieberling put him in touch with Dr. Bob. And they shared their experience, strength, and hope. And then Dr. Bob and Bill went to Bill Dean. And that's the way it's gone. And now there's over 1.5 million of us. God said, I love these people. And you're going to be my people. You're going to be my agents to bring hope and healing. I am so glad to be a part of that. Aren't you? Aren't you? Praise God.
Now, you want me to tell you the truth? I had plenty of time to look you up. But when I introduce a speaker, I don't think I ever have. I never looked one up and sit down and talk with him about anything. You see, it wasn't any need to. This morning, now I've known you all my life. On behalf of Board of Trustees and Blackstone, we'd like for you to take this little momentum home with you and remember us. Someone lost a pill box, and it's. I'm surprised Gene gave it to me. It's still got some pills in it. We'll close by praying together the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. And give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the power and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. Oh, man. Thank you, John. God love you. Oh.